Okay, this is your second video here on civic republicanism, okay? I hope that first video is relatively clear. We'll have time to talk about it coming up as well, okay? I'm going to return to my little circles that I do, right? And I really want you to keep that in mind during the whole thing. So what happens? You have a family. That family is incomplete. Groups that are incomplete on their own have to combine together into a larger thing we're going to call society. And on top of society is government. Okay? Now remember, we talked about good citizens. We talked about tradition, right? There's another key word that I want us to think about here, which is what is called the common good. Okay? The common good relates to this outside circle, and it's whatever is going to best further our common life through time. Okay, so upholding traditions is definitely part of the common good, because that's generally speaking conducive to furthering our common life through time. Really bad traditions, though, you are justified in getting rid of. Okay, I want to keep that in mind, right? Or going to fight in a war, that's the common good, because we need to protect everybody to keep our society going. So it's not, liberalism tends towards a kind of interest-based analysis of politics. This is definitely not, it's not against individual interests, to be very clear. Sometimes people think, oh, well, civic Republicans just want us to be these altruistic angels. No, that's definitely not the case. But the common good is to them a motivating factor, okay? So, and it's very important. So the common good is whatever perpetuates our common life through time the best. What we're seeing here, though, is an analysis of group life, just in general, that's much more dynamic than what you get from liberalism. Liberalism, look to the family, okay, I guess people have families, that's cool. Civic Republicans are look at how important families are. And a lot of traditional conservatism and a lot of Christian religious conservatism is best understood using this way of thinking. But remember, groups are, they have to combine together. I want to go a little bit further on that analysis. So I did the different families, right? Well, what about farmers and blacksmiths? Okay? Economic groups matter for civic Republicans as well, and there's a kind of trade that's going to happen here in the economy. Because remember we said economy, we need all those economic things going on. So all these different groups are actually going to be contributing in their own special way to the common good. Well, farmers are giving us food, so that's really awesome. We need food. You know who else needs food? Blacksmiths. What do blacksmiths do? They make tools. Who needs tools? Farmers need tools to make food. Food for tools. That's the trade, okay? So all the economic groups in a society as well, they're incomplete, but they're also all giving to that common good, okay? And then you could sort of continue this. Ethnic groups can be put into here. Religious groups like priests and believers. Well, believers need priests to tell them what the religion's about, and priests need believers because that's what they're there for. So students and teachers, police and teachers. You can do this trade with all kinds of different things, right? So really, really, really important analysis of group life. All these different groups contributing to the common good. Interestingly, one of the main groups that Aristotle saw, and that really forms an important basis of his entire political theory, is a class distinction between what he called the one. I just did a one little dot there for the one, Then this larger cutout is the few. These are rich and powerful people, billionaires. I don't even think being a millionaire nowadays would put you in the few. You got to have at least like 10 or 20 million, I think, before you're up here in the few. And then many is just everybody else. Okay? So many is everybody else. And this is what Aristotle saw. Aristotle's a pretty smart dude. He traveled around the different Greek city-states and he looked at their constitutions, and he saw that in all these different city-states they had the same social grouping. It looked different depending on where he went, but everywhere he went there was few and the many, and usually a one. The one is kind of optional in civic republicanism, but it happens a lot. So I put it in there, and it's going to help us when we get to thinking about like the origin of the U.S. system of governance. Okay, so one, few, many, just a very basic social class distinction. But remember, all the different groups are supposed to be contributing to the common good. Okay, and I'm going to show you here how they do that. Okay, but really, what Aristotle did was he then wanted to basically found his entire system of politics on this big distinction that he saw, and he saw it happening in many other places, okay? So I'm now going to erase this and tell you about Aristotle and types of government. This typology of government, you still see it actually even academically some places. I mean, that's how far ahead of the time Aristotle was. Well, Aristotle says, look, some forms of government are kingships. They're just the one. So it's that guy, right? Some are based on the few. We would call that oligarchy or aristocracy. So kind of depending, this is just fine differences sort of depending how it's set up. If it's hereditary, it's more aristocracy. If you can kind of buy your way in, it's a little more oligarchy. But, okay, small distinction. And some are based on the many, which he calls democracy. Okay? But Aristotle has a problem. He says these types of governments, they can all be good in the sense, and all he means by good is any government that's doing a reasonable job at securing the common good, perpetuating your common life together through time. Any government that's like pretty close, like think of it like shooting arrows, it's like you're maybe not bullseye every time, but you're like in the circles, like, okay, so you're doing fine, maybe it could be better, like let's work on that. But you're not completely crazy. But he has a problem. This is his problem. He goes, look, these pure forms of government, they're prone to turn into the opposite of from good, which is become bad. So let's just think like kingship, right? You have a really great king. He's amazing. Everyone loves him. He's doing a really good job. What happens? His son's a total idiot. It's like King Joffrey, Game of Thrones, right? This was more fun when Game of Thrones was like a big deal. I had like good 5 years of like Game of Thrones jokes that I got to put in here. But kingship, what happens? It degenerates into what we could call despotism, right? Despotism is basically North Korea. You piss off Kim Jong-un, you're dead, right? That's bad. We don't want that, right? That's really extra bad, okay? Oligarchy or aristocracy, same thing. We'll call it tyranny of the few. Okay, so at first you have aristocrats or oligarchs that are pretty nice. They're making good decisions. They're getting you pretty close to where you want to be, but they get bad. And then democracy, which he actually thinks is one of the worst, pure democracy. Oof, mob rule, that's bad, right? These are all bad. These are all I don't know if mob rule is any worse than King Joffrey, to be honest, right? So Game of Thrones is full of really bad kings, right? And historically speaking, Vlad the Impaler and these types of guys, ugh, who wants that, right? Oligarchy and aristocracy, long tradition in civic republicanism of basically arguing that like this is sort of a little bit more the better government type. But here, notice here his problem though. None of these on their own is perfectly stable. And having a pure form of government always threatens to degenerate into the opposite. So what does he want to do? This is what he comes up with. I'll just leave it oligarchy because I erased it already. Aristotle says, listen guys, here's my solution. We're going to have a government that has all three elements in it. We're going to call that the mixed constitution. Okay? Because bam, 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 they're all there. They all get to participate in decision making. Or we could call that civic republicanism. Okay? And that's what makes republicanism different from these pure forms of government. The king has certain roles and things he gets to do. There's a place for the aristocrats, and there's a place for the Democrats. Let me give you an example of the mixed constitution in the real world. Let's take, say, Britain, circa 1700, right? I mean, this is like high immigration to the United States. What did the British government look like at that point? King, House of Lords, Lords for the aristocracy. Hey guys, here's your house. Go be there. House of Commons. One, few, many. Now, I want to be really clear about something. Britain did not design it this way, okay? So they didn't like read Aristotle and go like, I know, by golly chap, over a tea and crumpet, I know what we have to do. No, he doesn't do that. It's a terrible British accent. I'm sorry if that was offensive. I'm not going back though, okay? I think I should be able to make fun of the Brits. Come on, I gotta have somebody I can still make fun of. King, one. House of Lords, few. House of Commons, many. Works beautifully. And so what happened, Britain was just going through their history, and they had like the Magna Carta, and then they had the Glorious Revolution, and actually right around even pre-Glorious Revolution, civic republicans in Britain, they're like reading Aristotle, and they were more reading Machiavelli and some other guys at the time. It doesn't really matter. They're like reading some civic republicanism, like boring, right? What you had to read, essentially. And they're like, they look at their system of government, they go, we did it! How did we know to do this? And they didn't. It's just history, they kind of evolved into it, right? But they're like, oh, great job, guys, we're the best, like, Britain's amazing. So there you go. Well, what do you think? Considering that the American system of governance was set up off of the British, oh, look at that. We did it on purpose. Our founding fathers looked at what happened in Britain, and they read Aristotle and a bunch of their civic republicans, and they said, this is a great idea. Let's have a president. So even check this out. I mean, even the powers of the president are strongly modeled off the powers of the British king. Okay? So he's almost like an elected monarch. Like, he gets a lot of the same powers. In some cases, he has a little bit more. In some cases, he has a little bit less. I mean, compared to the time nowadays, British king doesn't, you just like do ceremonies and stuff, right? But there's the one. The Senate, notice how in the United States, we don't have an aristocracy the way they did in Britain. But do we have very wealthy people? Well, yeah, of course we do. We still have people who are born into tons of, Paris Hilton, right? Like, her dad makes a bunch of money, she's born into it. She's one of the few. Well, but we don't want to have an actual aristocracy. So what did we do? This was very smart of our founding fathers. The Senate represents states, and it's really kind of the states that are the few in the American system of governance. So it's kind of a replacement, if you will, for the fact that we didn't have an actual aristocracy, but they were looking for some place, and the Senate is, at least theoretically, a place for more dignified discussion, okay? And historically, it's been that way. It's changed a lot in the last, 10 years, but historically, the Senate has been just like that. And then the House of Reps, this is the Democratic element. Why are we a Democratic Republican? Why is it Democratic Republic? The House of Reps has the most power out of these three, okay? The British version was probably a aristocratic republicanism. In France, they had more of they had civic republicans, and they pictured the monarchy as a kind of monarchical republic, where the king had more power, but the aristocrats had a place to go, and the people also had a place to go to participate and have a say in their political life, okay? House of Reps has the most power. Democratic republicanism. How do I know they have the most power? Two things. Power of the purse. That means the House of Representatives is more in charge of budgeting. So they're more budgeting is more important for them. And they're the ones who have the right to declare war. Now, the president can go around that declare war thing. And we have seen a big rise in presidential power through the 20th century. But historically speaking, if you look at what our founders intended, they actually wanted the president to be a little bit weak. Certainly not as strong as he is today. So just keep that in mind. So the president has really risen up in power. The Senate's still pretty important. I don't know. They're all important, but it's actually a pretty balanced system now. But what? This is civic republicanism, right? Ding, 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 ding. Here we go. Off and running, right? Now, let's take this analysis of the few and the many even further. Remember this term, civic virtue, okay? So remember I said all the different groups also have their own thing that they bring and contribute to society? Well, this is how Aristotle's thinking. Kings, or monarchs or presidents, executives in some sense, they have particular virtues. One of the great things about them is they are independent. Okay? So they're not beholden to either the few or the many. And a good president will then kind of, when it's right, he'll say no, the many are right today. And the next week he'll say, no, the few are right today. And depending on who's really got a better idea, he'll align more with that group in order to sort of make the common good happen. Okay, but presidents are executives. Whoops. Sometimes you just get someone who's really bad in office. You get that idiot king, right? And what are you going to do, right? So maybe he is always aligning with one side over the other, and that's causing trouble. Maybe he's just not very good at his job. Maybe he's corrupt, I don't know, whatever, right? But independent, but dumb/bad. With the few are very important, like I said. This way of thinking actually, looks at the few and gives a very positive evaluation overall. The few have military valor, which is big, right? Remember, war making and being a citizen willing to go to war is really important in the civic republican way of thinking. They also have political vision. They can see projects far into the future, and they're leaders. And civic republicanism needs leaders. On the other hand, they want to oppress the many, so they don't like the many, they're kind of mean to the many, and they like to hog all social honors for themselves. So by social honors, he means, awards. He also means advancements in society. So like they don't want to let the many into like their special little club. Okay, it's like Kobe Bryant like never saw a shot he didn't like, right? Like they're kind of ball hogs. Okay, the many are the most powerful, and they're also the best judge of music, poetry, and leaders. Sorry, it's a little chicken scratchy at the bottom. But they're the best judges of music, poetry, and leaders. Okay. On the other hand, what gets weird? They're irrational. Right. This brings us back to mob rule. Okay. All right. But look at what's happening here. Look at what Aristotle just did for us. This tight, beautiful little bow. Well, look, the few, they have leadership. So that's going to take this problem off the board, right? The few, they have good leadership. They're going to help the many by giving them good projects to work on. But they also need the many because the many are the powerful ones, right? Well, look at how this helps. The many can protect themselves because they got power too. They can basically just self-defense. I mean, sometimes with guns, not usually. More, it's just like voting and stuff like that. But every once in a while, people kind of like fight in the streets. Not great, but it's not always the end. And they can protect themselves so that the many don't oppress them. Together, both groups keep the executive from being dumb or bad, and the institutions of the mixed constitution or the republic bring out the best in everybody while having all those vices counterbalance or countervail each other. Okay? Now, I know it's a beautiful, pretty little system. Aristotle is aware it doesn't always work right. And that's okay. Like, it's like there's a good analogy here with like teamwork, right? You're playing basketball. I know I do a lot, but like that's my life. I love basketball, right? It's like, oh, well, a great basketball team really is kind of constructed this way. You have the one, the few, and the many. You got LeBron and Anthony Davis. You got the rest of the starters and some key subs. And then you got like those other guys and they all still matter, right? And theoretically, when things are going right, this is what happens. And sometimes teams don't go right. Look at what happened to the Clippers, right? The Clippers fell apart. Their mix was wrong. They weren't able to get all the good stuff that they needed, and instead they just couldn't get there. So, sometimes students want to say like, oh, well, it's too pie in the sky. And Aristotle's just saying like, no, look, I'm just explaining how things go when they work right. We all know when they're not working right. And that's it. Like, your theory can't protect me from myself. Well, sorry, like, no duh, right? Like, you do your best, but, so anyway, so it's, it seems, I kind of tease Aristotle. Oh, he wraps it up for us in this nice little bow. Well, he's also kind of saying, like, look, this is what it is when it's working well, not like, this is how it's always going to work, okay? But what's one of the other interesting, so look, this is all civic virtue, right? And all the different groups are contributing to that civic virtue. And then, don't forget, the common good. Okay? And Aristotle really thinks that the republic, which mixes the three different groups together, it's the best because it does the best job at identifying the common good. It does the best job at perpetuating the common good through time. If you only have the one, you're stuck with this flippy-floppy back and forth, or if you only have the few, you have that same problem, and you only have the many, you have that same problem. By incorporating all three different social groups into collective decision-making, they check and balance each other. This is where our founding fathers got the notion of checks and balances, okay? They check and balance each other and have a much greater chance of reaching the common good. So I'm going to go back to my Civic Republican key terms. I'm going to add a little bit more to it. Let's see, do I have other ones I wanted to get in here? This is pretty good though, okay? So it's no longer Aristotle's typology, it's key terms. Okay? So remember, fundamental primary assumption, man is a political animal. Sometimes that gets translated as social, okay? Man is a political or social animal. Civic virtue is what? The qualities of a good citizen. Common good is whatever will perpetuate our common life through time best. Tradition, this hugely important thing for civic Republicans. Tradition gives us, it gives us a sort of identity as a group. It also contains this kind of like your collective wisdom, inherited wisdom through time, right? So, and like I said, we want to be really clear about this. Tradition's not like, traditions is getting me and like pounding you on the head. And you're like, no, right? You're supposed to craft new. You're supposed to add to your traditions by working through them, okay? So checks and balances, citizenship, right? Also just sort of basic citizenship, but checks and balances. This is the checks and balances in the Constitution. They come straight from civic republicanism. So we see a lot of liberalism in there too. That's one of the cool things about the Constitution. It's kind of woven together kind of thing, okay? So I just want you to remember this, and we'll have one more lecture on civic republicanism. Before I forget, just to add to it, this was the one I had to add. One, few, many. Okay? And there's one other interesting consequence here. Very interesting consequence. Aristotle saw everywhere that there were social classes. And he said, look, that just means, like, it's kind of a fact of life, is that we're going to have social classes. What does that mean? I'm going to blow your mind right now. Inequality is natural. I know you're all triggered to think like John Locke. We're all born equal. Everyone's so equal and so wonderful and Okay, well, maybe empirically speaking, that's wrong. I remember my lecture on John Locke. I'm like, he's all nice at first, and then what happens is, within the span of 10 pages, now you just like are born into being an aristocrat and nobody can say anything and who cares? I mean, like, that's a very weird, you start with equality and you end up with inequality that quickly. And it's a kind of unquestioned inequality. Civic Republicans actually do question equality and inequality. So they might say inequality is natural, but it doesn't mean you can't talk about how much is preferred, okay? So you've got to keep this really important, because the other thing people say about civic Republicans, which is wrong, is like, oh, well, they just don't care, so they just think rich people can just stay rich. Well, yeah, I mean, we don't want to tax them to death if we're going to be civic Republicans, but you know what they do in Rome every once in a while? They just take a bunch of land and give it to people, like, sorry, Senate, like, you guys have hoarded too much power, remember? I showed they like to hog all social honors for themselves and all of that. So every once in a while, the people in Rome, they would just get together and be like, we're taking half of everybody's land who has more land than, X amount, and we're giving it out to people to be farmers. Because, okay, yeah, inequality, we're still leaving you with a ton of land. We're still going to be unequal, but we're going to reduce that inequality, okay? So really interesting way of thinking here. A lot of my work is in the civic Republican box, but notice I do some liberalism too, so I try to be fair to everybody, right? Principle of generosity. But civic Republicanism has some really nice sort of like empirical grounds to lay on, which is liberals can get around, but it does kind of make me question the utility, the usefulness of liberal philosophy sometimes, because it turns into so much of a philosophical exercise. And I'm like, well, how does this actually going to happen? They say like, oh, well, people should just go in politics and make it happen. I'm like, well, but it's not happening. Like, you know, like help a brother out. So I had to get that inequality is natural in there. And again, it doesn't mean we're just going to let people stay rich and never tax them. Like, you can tax them, just don't tax them into the poorhouse. Leave them with a ton of stuff. Just take, a good amount of it. So there you go.